I'm going to start off with Deborah Brennan. Deborah is a lecturer in maths, analytics, systems analysis and research at TU Dublin, where she's also joint coordinator of the Centre for Critical Media Literacy. She's published stakeholder research on the policy definition and control of implementation for TU Dublin, and has a particular interest in robust methods for obtaining hard-to-get stats for hard-to-reach populations. I have no idea what I have just read there. Statistics and oh my god, I got a bypass through first year in college with stats, and the note said this student should not take any of the physical sciences. So that was tough. That was tough, and you got to talk about it. So on a more practical level, she's a mother of 3 young children, one of whom has Down syndrome, and she's a PhD student in social justice equality studies here at UCD, researching in the area of inclusion, belonging and equality for children with disabilities in the Irish education system. Deborah, you're on. Thank you.
So before I start, because I've been in trouble before for not recognising the role of teachers, so I'm here today thanks to my children's wonderful school, where 3 of them go, in Oatlands in Stillorgan, my child with Down syndrome included, and they're I think at after school club now, and I did the hard maths on this particular research while they were at Kilmacud Crokes summer camp, which is wonderfully inclusive, and their school summer camp as well. So this is just to show that it can be done. It wasn't always that way, and my interest in this particular area came about because of my son's earlier exclusion from school for behavioural issues. So this research, you may have heard of it before. This was conducted with Harry Brown, who's sitting over there, and myself, and a group of 3 participatory researchers and Inclusion Ireland on the prevalence of short school days or reduced timetables in the Irish school system. So this was a phenomenon that we were aware of anecdotally. A lot of the advocacy agencies were telling us that children with disabilities were being sent home from school early. The practice was very often illegal, and nobody had any idea of the extent. We were aware that internationally this was happening as well, but no statistics were gathered. If a child appeared for any part of the day, their name was recorded on the roll, and that was it. Parents had attempted to inform TUSLA, for example, that their child wasn't getting the full school day, and TUSLA had no method of recording this. Department of Education, no process for recording. So it was an invisible practice. Through this research, we discovered that 1 in 4 children with disabilities, and the research covered all disabilities, had already experienced a short school day or reduced timetable, which means that in the future they may actually experience more, because some of these children were 4 or 5 years old. So, you know, we weren't looking at them at the end of their school career, we were looking at them right now. So a minimum of 1 in 4 children with disabilities, 1 in 3 with autism had already experienced it, and many of the suspensions continued for months or even years. So since the publication of our results, the Minister for Education and Skills has announced that the suspensions need to be reported, and in fact, and in fairness, he had stated before that they were illegal, that they shouldn't happen, and that children shouldn't be put on short school days because of behaviour, but that the NEPS, the National Psychological Service, Education Psychological Services, should be called and assistance given to the schools. So this was an IRC funded research project, and there's our team there. There's Harry Brown, who's over there, with Chris, Margaret and Tomas, and they're all working towards a certificate in research by apprenticeship as part of their participation in this study with Inclusion Ireland. So the study involved a mixed methodology, and this is one of the things, sorry, I'll do a bit of maths teaching here. This is one of those methodologies where you talk to people and you also gather statistics. Okay, so we also consulted with, so we did in-depth interviews with 12 caregivers of children with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities, and these children had already experienced short school days or various exclusions from school. We talked to 4 behavioural experts currently working in the area, and we put out an online survey which we entitled Education and Disability. We didn't tell anybody outside of the team that this was actually about short school days. So we asked lots and lots of questions, and our idea was that we could get a comparative statistic if we asked everybody who had a child with disability that we could reach to answer the survey. So the majority of people actually came back having neutral or positive experiences of the school system, and that was how we were able to get this statistic. We had 658 responses, and we used 393. I won't bore you with the details of how we selected them, but they were ones that we thought were solid in that they were consistent and relatively complete. We didn't ask people to answer all of the questions on the survey because some of them were quite personal and some of them weren't really relevant to them. The number of responses that we got, 393, represented 0.5% of the population of children with disabilities in the country, and that way we can say that this is statistically significant in a way that we can make a projection for the percentage of the population quite solidly with a confidence interval of about 5%, so our margin of about 5%. So we can say we're 95% sure that, give or take 5%, the numbers that we give you are an accurate representation of the population. So the respondents to the survey, we were very, very careful because we wanted to get a policy change out of this to make sure that our reach was very far. So we got children with a broad range of disabilities from every county. The distribution was reasonably pretty much the same as the national prevalence. So the largest number of children had autism, then it was intellectual disability, and so on. The ratio of male to female matched pretty much the ratio of male to female children with a registered diagnosis of disability in the country. We surveyed parents of children who were in mainstream classes, special schools, units, etc. Again, pretty much the result came back pretty much as you'd expect it to be for the country. There were 20 children who were registered in school but no longer went to school, and most of the population was white Irish, English speaking. The socioeconomic parameters were pretty typical, a little bit higher than you'd usually get, but that would be a reflection of people who were computer literate and whatever, because this survey was sent out on the internet and distributed via advocacy agencies, so places like Down Syndrome Ireland and various other parents' organisations. So most of the respondents were actually mothers. They were female caregivers or mothers, and 15% were parenting alone. Now, I'm sorry for that really long, boring detail, but it's kind of important just to say that our statistics are fairly solid here, okay? We believe at least. So the topics included diagnosis, education, school interventions, therapies, and so on. And we did find that therapies, one of the really major things was that most parents, I think very, very high percentage of parents felt that their children weren't getting the therapies that they needed. We also asked on the emotional, health and financial impacts of these school suspensions on the parents. Now, although they were very specific suspensions and specific difficulties to do with school in and around short school days, because we sharply targeted this at comments that had been made by the Minister for Education surrounding short school days. There are other aspects of school, like the unavailability of school places for children entering school, that would be impacted, we believe, in the same way in terms of the impacts on parents. So we got the shocking statistic, and we were very surprised when it came back, it had to be said. We didn't know what we were going to get. But when we came back, when the numbers came back, out of 72 children who had experienced short school days, that their parents could remember, there were more than 72, but 72 where the parents could properly remember exactly what had happened. We found that a very large proportion, the duration of the suspension was 6 months or more. The second bar that we have there, several occasions of a total of more than 20 school days, and so on. You can see them there. The ones that I've marked in orange are potentially illegal. So if the parent didn't agree, they would be illegal suspensions. If the parent agreed, they would be legal. And we weren't. I'll talk about that in a minute. So it was very, very serious. The duration. These weren't, being sent home for a few days, for 3 days or whatever. These were very serious. We were quite shocked by that. So the school suspensions were mostly, in the first pie chart there, you can see the orange there, were mostly to do with the child's behaviour. We weren't terribly surprised because every time the minister spoke about it, he spoke about behaviour. So we were guessing people were telling him their child had been, or children had been excluded because of behaviour. The second largest category was disability. And then quite a small, which is the light blue there in the first one, was the schools had told the parents that it was due to lack of resource, which we hear a lot, that it's about resource, but there was something else going on there. The behaviour-related incidents were very varied. We had everything from speaking loudly to hurting staff. And the number of hours attended each day, the typical number of hours was 2 to 3 hours, which really impacted on the parents as well as the children. Lack of resource, etc. I've kind of explained that there already. So the next thing here is that the pressures felt by the primary caregivers or parents. The child's behaviour given as a reason, we have there, out of 81 cases, 45 child's behaviour was given as a reason. Where behaviour was given as a reason was were psychological services or outside services or CAMS called, in most cases, no. And the proportion of caregivers who felt under pressure was extremely high there. I think it's 51 out of 78 cases, which meant that if they felt pressure, they may have been agreeing to it and then rendering the suspension, in fact, legal. So the child there, this particular graph is showing the orange, and the light orange is either the child missed school subjects or the parents think that they did. So the educational impact on the child was quite significant. We also asked all of the parents in the survey about their feelings of their child's feelings of belonging and inclusion in school, and there are a number of measures there. What we found tremendously significant actually was the after-school activities, which is here. And the children who had experienced short school days are marked in orange and the whole population in blue. But we see that children weren't very well included in school, whether they were having difficulties or not, or whether the parent was reporting that they were getting on well in school or not. It was a very small percentage of children who were actually engaging in the full range of school activities and social activities. When the children were suspended, the orange bars there are the negative effects of suspension, and the blue the positive effects. So really the picture that I'm trying to paint you here is that these suspensions were having quite a negative impact on the child's self-esteem and consequently their behaviour. So you're getting a cycle of the child may be suspended for bad behaviour, then feels very bad, and then there's more bad behaviour, if you like. And when I say bad behaviour, So the first thing that was reported to us by Inclusion Ireland when we asked what the impact on the caregiver was this idea of the caregiver being expected to be available throughout the day to pick up their child, which clearly impacts on not only their ability to work, but their mental health as well. And the parents that we interviewed tend to tell us that they were watching their phone all day, waiting. We asked the parents how the suspensions, and not just these illegal suspensions, legal, illegal expulsions or whatever, had affected their own health and mental health. And the bars there represent, the blue on the bottom is all families. The grey line above is where you have two parent families. The orange line is one parent families, and the yellow line above there is parents parenting, single parents parenting alone in rented accommodations. This was one of the things that we found, was that the impacts on parameters of health and mental health got worse as your social situation became more difficult. That's hardly a surprise, but it is absolutely astounding to see that a parent parenting alone was twice as likely in many cases to have a physical or mental health impact if they were living in rented accommodation. The numbers are very small there, by the way. So we have 11 parents parenting alone in rented accommodation, but I think you can see that the pattern is very clear. And statistically, we're not really concerned that that isn't, representing 100% or 100 parents or anything like that, because the overall sample is statistically significant and the pattern is very consistent. When we move on and we ask about the impacts, the work impacts on parents, we see that the orange line at the top there is those parents who are parenting alone, and the blue line is the all families there, so the blue line there, and this is statistically significant. And we see those parenting alone were struggling on much harder in those situations where they had various, quite serious impacts at work. They had to leave work, they were under pressure in work, they were being late for work, and so on. Taking carers leave. And one thing that we noticed was that not one of the parents in our survey who was parenting alone took parental leave. So they were suffering very, very severe pressure in work, but not taking parental leave. And those taking carers leave was quite small as well. So the financial impacts on families parenting alone, the orange line says if there was a financial impact, the blue line there wasn't, and then the bottom two bars there is all families. So again, I don't want to minimize this in any way. The financial impact on families where there were two parents was over 50% of them were financially impacted by these suspensions. When it was a parent parenting alone, it was 75% where there was a financial impact. There's a great difficulty here is that the law is very complex around education, but basically what it says is that your child is entitled to an education in the mainstream as long as it isn't impacting another child, and as long as their inclusion in mainstream isn't impacting another child. So together with the law there, the lack of training that you have in schools, the lack of resource in schools, children are very often left at home with their caregiver. And home tuition grants are given in some cases, but in most cases that's a maximum. It's a maximum of 20 hours. Most cases people can't access the full 20 hours. Very often the tutor is somebody who can come to the house after they've worked their full day in school, so they're teaching after. So if you're a parent who has one parent or one child in school in the day, and then you have a tutor there in the afternoon, it sort of stops you being able to work at all. Very often the parent has to stay at home as well while the tutor is there, and the parent has to recruit the tutor. So, there's no other situation where parents have to recruit their child's teacher. For many other children, there's no appropriate, we hear this in the news all of the time, there's no appropriate school place and they remain at home. And other children are ill and are at home, and that means that their caregiver is also at home. So, very often we all use, and I'm using today, the school as a babysitter while I'm here and working. So when the state allows some mothers to work and it educates their children, cares for their children, and has others at home, that's an inequality. It's an inequality because the child is deprived of education, the mother of work, and the family of income. Some mothers choose to stay at home, but those who don't choose to stay at home really need to have the same support as the other mothers. And we've also seen the impacts on families of suspensions and loss of income. We think that mothers parenting alone act as a barometer. Very often mothers who are working or couples where both of them are working are absorbing a lot of the impact. where you don't have a second person to pick up the slack, you can see it. So those statistics for the mothers parenting alone are significant for all families. Right, so I'm going to just skip on to the onto the recommendations here. So parental leave is unpaid and unflexible, and it's rarely used. It's also the same number of weeks depending on whether a child has a disability or not. You can get an extension to 16 years, if it's normally up to 12 years, 16 years if the child has a disability, but if there aren't any more weeks. Carers leave needs to be medically warranted. So if your child doesn't have a medical condition, you're not entitled to get carers leave. Carers allowance and benefit can be claimed. It can't be claimed in respect of children who don't have a medical need. And there are serious restrictions on social welfare rent support. The HAP housing scheme now requires you to be on you have to be on the housing list to access rent support. So if you're in a situation where you are working, have to leave work because your child has been excluded from school, your income that for your job is taken into account and you're not entitled to rent support under the current system. And a final point there is that caregivers don't have the legal right to attend their children's appointments. So policy change for caregivers. The role of SNA should be developed, rewarded appropriately, and SNAs should be available for extracurricular activities in school camps to enable children to develop their social skills and enjoy their community while their caregivers work. Parent as partner arrangements, such as parents hiring tutors for home tuition, really needs to be reconsidered. Mothers and caregivers should not foot the bill via lost earnings for the state's failure to provide appropriate education for their children. And home tuition and care should be provided where necessary if the state can't provide that. And this is just the final slide here. So what I would propose is that where the state cannot provide an education, that carers leave should be granted regardless of medical need to parents whose children have a disability until an appropriate place should be, until an appropriate school arrangement can be found for their child. That should not be taken out of the normal 104 weeks, and they should be afforded allowances for rent or mortgage payments at the same time. And parents, all parents should be allowed by law to attend the medical and disability appointments for their children. Thank you.
So we can open up for a few questions. Yeah, when you're answering questions, you need to stay online. All right there.
Right. I need to stand up
You
as well.
need to.
Sorry. I'm here.
That's gone off out into the ether somewhere there as well. So, any questions, anybody? Talent down the back there has one for you.
Hi.
I'm Talent from Spina Bifida in Hydrocephalus Island. You mentioned the issue of lack of resources. Do you have more information on that? Like, is this SNA time? Is this
Lack of resources, well, we do and we don't. In the sense the parents were often just told lack of resources and it wasn't specified really to the parents. From other sources we know what the lack of resources were, but this was a study where parents were reporting back, and the lack of resource sometimes was SNA, especially in the case of units, where sometimes we found that when a child was in a special class or unit, that the SNA allocation was shared. So you'd one SNA to 3 children, for example, and in some cases that meant that one child was permitted to attend school for 2 hours, then had to go home, another child come in, attend for 2 hours, go home, and so on. So that was one of the lack of resources. We're also aware of the lack of assistive technology, funding for assistive technology, and the delay in that. I think resources, training, both of those things, yeah.
One thing that I, because I struggled with stats and I really had to work on stats, I learned about skewing your data. and it's only a comment really, that if you have a parent who's alone and renting
Yes.
and has a child with challenging behaviour, the last thing they want to do is take a survey. Which means you don't have that population.
That's very,
for the-
that is very true. I think the fact that we got 15% parenting alone was reasonable, but
Okay.
you know, I think this was just a minimum. And what I would say about that is that because we don't have a very, possibly we haven't reached the full population there, that it really, I'd imagine that the ones who don't get to do the survey are possibly in a worse situation.
Right.
You know, so I wouldn't be particularly concerned that that's an overestimate. I'd be more concerned that it's an underestimate.
Exactly. That's what it would,
it'd be hard to
trying to
imagine
say.
how much further you could get,
I
though.
know.
You know, considering for the parents parenting alone and in rental accommodation, the mental health impact reported by themselves was 100%. So we couldn't get any higher than that, and we can assume that it probably is 100%.
And if you're not,
I've never come across a statistic of 100% before from a population. It was the very first time I've ever seen 100%. I've been doing it a while, you know.
And I suppose, and then the other thing that I suppose is just a comment as well of the provision of tutor. And because I'm from a rural area,
Yes.
and had a child that needed extra, we actually had to take her.
Yes.
Tutors never came. So it means you're packing up other children to go and sit outside the tutor's house for an hour, you know, so there is that rural and urban divide there as well. You know, it's an awful lot easier when you're in a suburb.
It is a lot easier.
So there's an extra difficulty.
I think that from the parents that we interviewed, where we were able to question them in depth, that even now, because there are teaching positions in schools available now, there are very few tutors free. So I think that even in suburbs and in urban areas, people are encountering that difficulty now.
Right.
And I know what you're saying, but
it just adds to the difficulty.
Yeah, and I think that in actual fact, your experience would be creeping into suburbs and cities now as well.
Right. Liam.
Just to say congratulations on Inclusion Ireland, working with Inclusion Ireland. They're one of our member organisations, and it's great to see organisations, you know, delivering quality research in collaboration with people from academia. So it strikes me as a really good example of what we need to do more of. Just a question of the timeline from maybe when the idea was hatched, maybe this has gone back to delivering it. What kind of timeline, and were there any learnings in that from you?
Oh my God, yeah. I think it was a year ago? Yeah, just about a year ago now that we, Harry Brown over there, noticed on the Irish Research Council's website that they were doing something that we were doing, and we partnered up. It's difficult. The time frame was incredibly short. So we had our publication, our report was launched on the 5th of September, which was 10 months later. And in the meantime, we had to get ethics clearance. And that's one of the great difficulties with university work, is that you do have to get ethics clearance, and ethics committees don't meet very often.
Was this pre-GDPR or post-GDPR?
It was post, and this and a vulnerable group and the whole lot. So we're very lucky, I have to say, in TU Dublin we have an excellent ethics committee. They are really brave, I would say, very thorough, very, very good, but under-resourced like most things in universities, and they don't meet that often, and they're kind of understaffed. But we were lucky, but it put us under severe pressure. Because we had to have everything ready before we had ethics clearance. The day we got ethics clearance, we put it online, you know. But it was challenging, I have to say. And lessons learned, I think really, I don't know, Harry, do you have any suggestions for that? It was fast.
Well, it was fast, and it was fast partly because we were very keen to get something into the public domain at the first week of school, when the media is looking for education stories, and that was kind of my end of it, I think, the media side. And so we to some extent, we had put ourselves partly under
Yeah.
that time pressure. It's also the nature of this funding is it's a relatively short-term
Yeah.
project, but not quite as short-term as we made it.
Is this new
Yeah.
foundations or a different one?
It was new foundation. The other thing is, and that is true, I mean, I didn't want it to go another year because I thought that's a whole group of families and children who are suffering, and it's very hard not to do that. So we did put ourselves under pressure. We're used to doing it as well. You know, we're used to research, so we were able to do that. But I think the partnership with Inclusion Ireland was fantastic. It was really amazing, and it made it a lot easier for us to do the research because the domain knowledge that they had was phenomenal. The networks that they had, the possibility of once we released this, of getting it carried to all of those counties and across it was amazing. And we couldn't have done that without the partnership. In fact, the partnership made the research so much easier for us, I would say. It's a wonderful way to do research, and you know, I would certainly do it again.
We also conducted interviews all over the country.
Yeah.
The data that we present tends to be just from the survey, but the report.
Yeah, the reports,
includes
yeah.
extracts from the interviews that we did.
Which was all around the country, and again, Inclusion Ireland was incredibly helpful in helping us on that side and helping us source people for a research advisory committee and so on.
Thank you. It's great to hear.
Deborah, thank you very much. And an extra boule of us from the teaching stats.